A single barked command cuts through the humid courtroom air. Hands behind your back. Two deputies seize 70-year-old William Bill Carter, yanking him upright by his wrists. The metal cuffs clamp down and the echo of steel against flesh reverberates like a gunshot. A hush falls, broken only by a soft gasp from a black mother clutching her child's hand in the gallery. Across the room, a white councilman sneers, muttering about another angry veteran. Bill's eyes burn with a quiet fire, not of defiance, but of a man who's faced real battlefields and knows when injustice is closing in. If you've ever witnessed the shadow of prejudice loom too large, share your story below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapters of this powerful saga. The heavy oak doors swung open before sunrise, but Bill Carter was already waiting. He stood under the courthouse portico, his broad shoulders squared beneath a threadbare denim jacket, face set like flint. No one spoke. He didn't need to. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair and the hollows under his eyes, each line a testament to a lifetime of hard choices. Inside the courtroom's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat glow across pale walls and scuffed wooden benches. Bill ascended the narrow steps toward the defense table, every footfall measured, each breath deliberate. He wore the same faded jeans and scuffed boots he had on when two deputies hauled him in boots that once marched through foreign sands and rain-soaked jungles. Now they tapped hesitantly on the polished floorboards, as if asking permission to disturb the illusion of civility. A ripple passed through the gallery as he passed by. Old Marines in civilian clothes leaned forward, recognition flickering in tired eyes. They whispered among themselves, but fell silent if any courthouse official glanced their way. On the prosecutor's side, a young assistant fiddled with his notes, casting glances at Bill as though expecting a sudden outburst. When none came, he leaned back with relief, certain the crazy vet act was over. Bill's public defender, a weary woman named Laura Jensen, pored over a half-finished coffee and a stack of files. She looked up, once offered him a tight nod, then returned to her notes. The case file listed only a misdemeanor assault charge, a confrontation at the gas station, a younger man bruised and claiming Bill threatened him. No weapon, no serious injury, just words exchanged that spiraled into handcuffs. A petty fight had become a public spectacle. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Marion Ellis. Her gray bun, pulled tight, peered over her glasses at the crowded room. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice crisp, "you are charged with assault and intimidation." "How do you plead?" Bill's reply was slower than most, each word distinct but soft. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was steady, carrying the weight and calm of a man who'd stood on distant cliffs for hours waiting for a single right moment. Whispers rose like steam from a kettle. He's defiant. He's unhinged. Someone ought to teach him some respect. A young reporter snapped photo's lens, clicking through the awkward silence. Laura Jensen rose for her opening statement. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury." She spoke of due process, reasonable doubt, the dangers of assuming guilt based on rumors. She highlighted Bill's spotless service record decorations for valor and distinguished conduct buried in the file's second page. The prosecution objected, irrelevant. They said this is not a military tribunal. Bill remained motionless as Laura fought for every frame of context. No threats had been made. He'd been provoked. The other man lunged first, but each argument seemed to bounce off the jury's preconceived notions of aging warriors of veterans who can't let go of a black man perceived as volatile. During breaks, Bill didn't pace or fidget. He sat with his hands folded on the table, head bowed slightly. He didn't glare at the jury or curse under his breath. He simply waited like a coiled spring or a loaded rifle for the right moment to act, or until they realized no threat was coming. Outside, a handful of veterans gathered on the courthouse steps. Word had spread through quiet channels. Something's wrong with Bill's trial. They hadn't been invited, nor did they need a subpoena. They came because they knew him. Quiet Bill, they called him in the barracks because he never spoke more than necessary, but always acted with unwavering precision when lives were on the line. Inside, the prosecution called their lone witness the gas station attendant. He described Bill leaning over the counter, voice low but fierce, warning him to back off. The attendant admitted he'd felt afraid until he looked into Bill's eyes. That gaze had sent shivers down his spine, he said. The jury scribbled notes. They heard intimidation. They didn't hear protection, nor did they consider the blood on Bill's hands from past battles. Laura objected speculation, but the judge overruled. The jury may draw reasonable inferences. Bill's eyes flicked up once, meeting the witness's gaze. There was no anger there, only the same calm he'd worn when a 10-year-old Marine begged for help under fire. The courtroom seemed to inhale around him as if sensing something far larger than a misdemeanor. By late afternoon, closing arguments commenced. The prosecutor leaned in, voice oily with confidence. This isn't about heroism, it's about accountability. This defendant thinks his past gives him impunity. He waved a photo of Bill's uniform medals gleaming. He's clinging to memories that endanger our community. Heads nodded in the jury box. When Laura stood, her voice quivered at first, then strengthened. She spoke of sacrifice, of a soldier's code that doesn't end when the uniform is shed. She reminded the jury of the absence of any real threat of the other man's own aggression. She spoke of Bill Carter as a protector, not a predator, calling on their better judgment. The judge sent them to deliberate. As the jury filed out, Bill remained seated, hands still folded. The heavy chain dangling from his belt clanked softly as he shifted. He looked neither relieved nor concerned, just quiet, resolute. Moments later, General Marcus Hayes slipped into an empty seat in the back. 4 stars on his collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights. No one noticed him at first. Everyone was too sure they had the verdict they wanted. But Bill Carter's story wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the courtroom doors closed behind the jury, the real battle for justice was only just beginning. Welcome to the Veterans Chronicle. The narrator's voice draws you back into the story, warm and steady, as though pulling you by the sleeve into a private conversation. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you believe untold stories of valor and justice deserve the spotlight, hit that subscribe button. We've barely scratched the surface of William Carter's journey, and there's much more ahead. The plea hangs in the air like an invitation to gather around a campfire, not a sterile news bulletin. You can almost feel the soft glow of the studio lights as the camera pans away from Carter's silent figure at the defense table and sweeps back to reveal the courthouse itself. It's a humble structure, nothing like the grand courthouses you see in big cities. This one is a 2-story red brick building, its facade streaked with age. A faded plaque by the front steps proclaims County Courthouse, but paint peels at the edges as if the years have been impatient to move on. To the left sits the old public library, its once white columns now tinged yellow by time, and to the right, a small barber shop with a hand-painted sign promising cuts and shaves. Inside the soundscape is subtle but unmistakable, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the low murmur of staff behind a wooden reception desk, and the soft scrape of shoeless chess pieces as 2 retirees pass the morning in quiet competition under a skylight. Reporters have taken up discreet positions along the back wall, cameras balanced on tripods, notebooks at the ready. You can see them exchange glances, lean forward in anticipation. They're expecting a routine story, an old Marine tangled up in a minor dispute dismissed in a single day. But something in the air suggests otherwise. As the narrator's voice softens, you're reminded that this is more than mere courtroom drama. It's a glimpse into a town where everyone nods at strangers on the sidewalk and where authority still wears a uniform. Sheriff's deputies sit in the front row, arms crossed, watching the gallery with wary eyes. A patch of morning sunlight falls across the polished oak bench, where jurors will soon decide a man's fate. The camera lingers, letting you drink in the details: the chipped plaster, the rows of black leather chairs, the little clock above the judge's bench that ticks with calm persistence. You feel the weight of the place, the sense that in these walls, history unfolds daily in small, quiet ways that most people never notice. Yet here on this ordinary southern morning, history has already chosen its moment. Outside Main Street is waking up. The barbershop's door swings open, and the barber steps out for a quick smoke, nodding at the courthouse as if it were an old friend. Across the street, the librarian unlocks the glass doors and slides out the day's newspapers, the mastheads announcing headlines you'll never see on cable news. Local church hosts summer fair, county fairgrounds seek volunteers. Veteran seeks justice in misdemeanor case. Back inside the courtroom, the camera shifts to the jury box. 7 civilians and 5 alternates sit in rigid posture, their faces half-lit and half-shadowed expressions impassive. You catch fleeting looks exchanged between them. One juror tilts her head as if to ask, "Is this really about more than a parking lot scuffle?" Another fiddles with the edge of her program from Sunday service. Still, they haven't heard General Hayes' testimony yet. All they know is the dry docket entry and the prosecutor's sharp arguments. Laura Jensen, the public defender, stands and straightens her jacket before addressing the jury. You can hear the creak of leather as she shifts her weight, the subtle click of her pen tapping against a stack of papers. She speaks of fairness, of reasonable doubt, of the dangers of rushing to judgment when a black man's voice trembles in a room built for white voices. Her words fill the acoustic space, echoing off the walls and into the back rows. She makes it sound simple. A charge of intimidation requires proof beyond a whisper, beyond a fear stirred by rumor and speculation. But even as her voice holds, you sense her frustration. This isn't the courtroom she once envisioned defending heroes in, but one that has forgotten how to listen. The prosecutor rises next, a man in his early 40s with a crisp suit and a practiced smirk. He walks to the center of the floor, fingers brushing the edge of the swearing-in handrail. He addresses the panel with a measured cadence, speaking of Bill Carter's alleged threats, his dangerous ties to violence, his refusal to explain himself. He brandishes a photograph of Carter in uniform camouflage patterned against a foreign desert and tells the jury that memories of war don't earn a get-out-of-jail-free card. His words are confident, clinical, designed to chip away at the juror's compassion and replace it with caution. All the while, Carter remains motionless at the defense table. His once handsome face is etched with lines older than his years, lines carved by sun and sand and loss. He doesn't flinch when the prosecutor's words slice through the air, nor does he look to Laura for support. His hands rest on the oak like anchors, his gaze fixed on some distant horizon only he can see. Then, as if cued by an unseen conductor, the camera cuts to the back door. A black SUV glides in without sirens, without siren lights, just a whisper of rubber on concrete. General Marcus Hayes steps into the frame, his 4 silver stars clipped neatly above his pocket flap. He pauses to let the hush settle around him. The usual protocol's ID checks. Metal detectors are bypassed by mutual recognition and unspoken respect. Deputies part like a Red Sea, and reporters click their cameras in surprise at this unannounced arrival. Hayes walks with quiet authority toward the gallery, and you feel the room constrict around his presence. The judge, mid-note, looks up, brow furrowed. The jury leans forward as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Laura Jensen's eyes widen slightly, recognizing the officer who once commanded the very special ops unit where Carter served. The prosecutor shifts nervously, his confidence flickering for the first time. No one speaks as Hayes reaches the front row and whispers to the bailiff, "I'm here to testify." The bailiff nods, gesturing toward the defense table. Hayes steps forward, each movement precise, measured like a man walking through a minefield he already knows by heart. He squares his shoulders with Carter and then turns to face the jury, drawing in a breath that seems to last an eternity. 30 years ago, he begins, voice calm but resonant. "I was pinned down in Fallujah. My unit was scattered communications cut. We had wounded. No extraction. The sun was a furnace overhead, the enemy closing in." He pauses, letting the details settle. Then almost casually, he adds, "That's when Gunnery Sergeant William Carter appeared, a single shot carving us a path to safety. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply did what needed to be done." A murmur rolls through the room. The jurors shift, the reporter's pen pauses, mid-scribble. Even the judge leans forward. Carter's hands tremble slightly as Hayes continues describing the 936-yard shot through a moving target, the crosswind, the uncertainty. He speaks not as a boast, but as a matter-of-fact record, drawing a map of Carter's valor in the jurors' imaginations. By the time Hayes finishes, you sense the tide has turned. The courtroom that once whispered of intimidation now hangs on every word, as if the memory of Carter's silence and restraint is finally being heard. The veneer of routine cracks, revealing something deeper. Respect, awe, recognition that heroes come in many forms, and that silence often conceals strength. Then, in a gesture that still echoes long after the gavel falls, Hayes drops to one knee before Carter, a salute transformed into an apology not for the man's actions, but for the institution that nearly forgot him. And in that single gesture, you understand that this story isn't just about a trial. It's about remembering, honoring, and reclaiming the voices we too often ignore. As the narrator's voice returns to guide you onward, you sit at the edge of your seat, eager for what comes next. The jury's decision, the fallout in the quiet town, and the final reckoning of a life lived in service and shadow. The building itself is unremarkable, a brick two-story relic tucked between a worn library and a sleepy barber shop on Main Street. Inside, the fluorescent lights hum above wooden pews, and the air smells faintly of old coffee and polished floors. Reporters whisper in the back row, sensing there's more here than a routine trespassing charge. As the camera drifts past the reception desk, where an elderly clerk nods politely at anyone who approaches, it captures the worn "Check-in Here" sign, its letters peeling like sun-bleached paint on an abandoned barn. Every detail feels deliberate, as if this modest courthouse were preserved unchanged to remind us that justice, even in its grandest ideals, often unfolds in the humblest of places. At the metal detector, a security officer in plainclothes gently pats down each visitor, his manner courteous but precise. He scarcely blinks at the line of civilians filing in. Teachers off their morning route, a nurse in scrubs. Two gentlemen pushing a double stroller, yet he straightens abruptly as General Marcus Hayes approaches his uniform insignia, commanding the same respect that a bow of the head would. No one interrupts the search. Protocols bend around his presence as naturally as water around a stone. Beyond the detector, the hallway stretches toward Courtroom 3. Along its walls hang framed portraits of past judges, each starched collar and powdered wig frozen in mid-sentence. A mahogany bench against the wall bears the weight of history, carved initials of long-forgotten law clerks, a small chip where someone once tested the wood's resolve. Here and there, a patch of sunlight spills through a high window, illuminating a single dust mote drifting in the air, an unassuming ballet of particles that might otherwise go unnoticed. Inside the courtroom, the setup is deceptively simple. The judge's bench sits elevated, flanked by the American flag, and the state banner there folds, hanging motionless. In front, the prosecutors' and defenders' tables face each other across an aisle marked by polished brass rails. The jury box, a snug enclave of plush seats, holds a dozen civilians whose expressions have hardened into a collective neutrality. They've been instructed to ignore everything but the evidence, yet the human eye is drawn to every out-of-place glance, every twitch of a lip. William Bill Carter remains at the defense table, shifting slightly as if to break a long-held pose. His denim jacket looks almost incongruous here, like a farmer's hands on a surgeon's tools. Near him, Laura Jensen organizes her notes, glancing up once to meet his steady gaze. In that instant, the hum of the light seems to drop away, as if the room itself is holding its breath. The prosecutor, Michael Reynolds, rises again, though his opening and closing statements have already carved grooves in his memory. He adjusts his tie, navy blue trimmed with a thin silver stripe, and smooths a crease in his jacket. His eyes flick toward the jury, searching for a flicker of doubt to fan into certainty. He speaks again of threats uttered over a gas station pump, of fear sparked in the other man's heart, of an aging Marine who clings too tightly to past glories. He presents Bill's military photograph as though it were the smoking gun itself. The medal's a taunt here is the man who ended wars. They seem to ask why not end this one just as decisively, yet all around subtle cracks begin to show. The jury's front row matron, a retired schoolteacher, leans back in her chair, brow furrowed. The college student beside her taps a pen against his knee, his foot tracing anxious rhythms. Even Reynolds' practiced cadence wavers when he notices the general's silhouette in the doorway. 4 silver stars gleaming like a verdict hanging in the balance. Breaks in the action lead into hushed halls where low voices discuss the case in careful tones. In the corridor, a small group of veterans stands clustered under a bulletin board plastered with community notices. Flea market dates, church potlucks, lost pet flyers. They've come uninvited, drawn by shared memories of Bill Carter's unflinching courage. They lean in close, trading fragments of the Fallujah firefight. He took out that machine gun nest. He never said a word when they thanked him. Their reverence is almost palpable, yet they keep their distance from the courthouse doors, as though this institution belongs to strangers, not to men who once fought and bled under the same banner. When the jury finally files back and the murmur in the room rises like a tide, the judge, Marian Ellis, waits until every seat is filled before calling the court to order. Her gavel is small but heavy, and when it lands, the sound cracks like a whip. She reminds the jurors of their duty of the presumption of innocence and of the high burden borne by even the simplest charge. Her eyes flick to Bill Carter, as if seeking reassurance that justice itself remains intact. General Hayes stands, then stepping forward through the aisle with measured steps that echo softly on the hardwood floor. Every eye snaps toward him. Some sink to their laps, uncertain if they've glimpsed a ghost. Others watch his progression as though witnessing a scene from another world, a world where orders are absolute and lives hinge on a single decision. Hayes's uniform is immaculate creases, sharp collar polished. He pauses before the jury box and bows his head in respect to the court. The hush is astonishing. Reynolds's lips part, and Laura raises an eyebrow, startled by the turn. The jurors exchange uneasy glances. Some share sly, conspiratorial smiles, while others appear to brace themselves. For a heartbeat, the only sound is the hum of the lights and the rush of distant traffic beyond the courthouse walls. Hayes addresses the judge first. "Your Honor, with permission, I wish to offer testimony." Judge Ellis nods as if summoning the gavel again, but restraining herself. She gestures toward the witness stand. "Proceed." When Hayes's boots click onto the witness platform, the room seems to expand to fit the gravity of the moment. He straightens, clears his throat, and begins not with legal jargon or dramatic flourish, but with a simple truth. 31 years ago, I was wounded in combat, trapped under debris. My team scattered. I thought I was done for. His voice carries the weight of every man who's faced his own mortality, every brother in arms who hoped a miracle would come. Then Bill Carter appeared. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for thanks. He simply did what needed to be done. As he recounts the sniper's wind-knowing shot from 36 yards away, the jurors lean forward. The reporter's pen stops mid-word. Even the judge shifts in her seat. Images flicker on in the courtroom gallery, a sandblasted horizon, a young Carter lying prone and calculating a single bullet, cutting through chaos to carve a path to safety. Hayes continues without embellishment. No heroics, just facts. 12 confirmed hits, 5 minutes that saved lives. Then silence, as though the battlefield itself paused to exhale. He never sought medals, Hayes adds quietly. He never spoke of it. I only heard the story secondhand until today. The courtroom crackles with a new energy. The jurors' hands unclench. The public defender exhales relief threading through her posture. The prosecutor's confidence flickers like a candle in a breeze. And Bill Carter at the defense table finally allows himself a small lift of the chin. His eyes sweep the room, no longer vacant, but alive with the quiet strength of a man who knows his worth without needing to proclaim it. Then Hayes does something no one expects. He drops to one knee in front of Bill, not out of ceremony, but as an apology for the system that mistook a hero's silence for menace. The courtroom holds its breath. A single bead of sweat glints on Carter's brow. The gavel sits idle on the judge's bench, as if paused to honor the moment. Judge Ellis rises slowly, her voice thick when she finally speaks. In light of this testimony, I find no grounds to continue this prosecution. Charges are dismissed. The gavel falls at last, but it lands softly like a final bow rather than a blow. Outside, the afternoon sun paints the brick facade in a warm glow. Reporters rush out, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward in a cacophony of eager voices. But Bill Carter and General Hayes walk side by side, unhurried, past the worn library and the barbershop. The veterans on the steps stand at attention as the two men pass, saluting without being asked. Carter's boots tap against the pavement, each step a quiet testament to battles won and battles renewed. The latter fought not with bullets, but with memory, respect, and the simple act of seeing a man for who he truly is. And so amid the peeling paint and the soft hum of Main Street life, this unassuming courthouse becomes the stage for something far greater than any misdemeanor trial ever intended, a humbling reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of justice happen not in grand halls, but in the hushed acknowledgement of what was always true. You've seen Bill Carter slip into that courtroom week after week, the same faded flannel, the same worn jeans, and still no bail, no outbursts, no pleas for mercy. It's like he's testing everyone's patience with his silence, forcing them to fill the void with assumptions. In the coffee shop across the street, folks mutter about PTSD episodes and dangerous temper flares as if they've diagnosed a man based on nothing more than a haunted stare. Yet, not one person has paused to ask about his service record, as if the weight of his medals and sacrifices were invisible behind those tired eyes. The rumor mill churns fastest in small towns. At the hardware store, the clerk lowers his voice. I heard he got into it with a kid over a parking spot, threatened him with a gun he doesn't even own. At the diner, the cook nods, sliding a chipped mug of coffee across the counter. Yeah, saw him pacing outside last night, kicking at the gravel, talking to himself. And somewhere a local blogger gathers these fragments into a sensational post complete with a red exclamation headline. Local veteran or local threat? Inside the courthouse, the tension coils tighter every time the judge calls the case. Bill walks in without looking left or right. His posture is rigid, shoulders squared beneath that flannel, and he takes the same seat at the defense table as though it's his post in an endurance exercise. Other defendants come and go. Their names called, their fates, decided release on recognizance, small fines, probation. Bill's case remains unresolved, lingering like an unanswered question. Laura Jensen, his public defender, watches him closely. She's grown used to his routine, no questions answered, no additional evidence offered. She'll meet his gaze briefly, then return to her notes, her fingers tapping a rhythm of growing frustration. How do you defend a man so determined to remain indefinable? She adjusts her glasses and flips to the page with his service record, a roster of commendations, a tapestry of proven valor, but she never gets the chance to share it. No one ever asks. Prosecutor Michael Reynolds has made his strategy clear. Paint Bill Carter as a relic with hair as white as his fears, hoarding grudges, and threatening civilians. He dismisses any mention of past heroism as irrelevant. Obsolete glory, he calls it, the kind best left behind when one hangs up the uniform. The jury nods, scribbling notes. To them, the photograph of a younger Carter in desert camouflage is just a relic, too proof of delusion, more than distinction. Outside the courtroom doors, a small group of veterans gathers each morning, speaking in low tones. They recognize Bill's gait, the careful set of his jaw, the way his eyes scan the room before he enters. They murmur of shared foxholes and firefights of nights when bullets drew trenches in their dreams. They know he's not broken, just burdened by memories too heavy for words, but they remain off stage, standing at the edges of the parking lot lawns, unwilling to cross the invisible line that separates veterans from civilians. Reporters sniff out the tension like bloodhounds. One local television crew interviews neighbors. You think he's dangerous, they ask. Well, my mother wouldn't go near that man. One woman says, clutching her purse, she said she saw him yelling at the moon last night. The reporter nods gravely, turning the clip into an ominous teaser. Tonight at 11, veteran versus society. The phrase itself is a verdict. Meanwhile, Bill's court hearings become a morbid spectacle. People bring folding chairs to the hall, children squirm in the back row, and an entire day's work can collapse into 10 minutes of testimony. Still, nothing changes. The bailiff unlocks his cuffs so he can stand. The judge calls recess, and the world breathes again. But each recess feels shorter than the last, a countdown not toward resolution, but toward an unspoken climax. Inside the hushed chambers, Bill remains a study in contrasts, the softness in his eyes when he glances at Laura, the hardness in his knuckles as he grips the table edge. He never loses his calm, yet his silence grows heavier, pressing down on everyone present. He's the eye of a storm that no one believes will ever fully materialize, but the charged air suggests otherwise. Every so often, a juror lingers outside the jury room doorway, listening to the echoes of Bill's muffled breathing. They step back when caught, but the moment lingers as though drawn by an inexplicable gravity. The judge, too, glances at him when she thinks no one is watching, scribbling in her notebook, before looking up with a curious tilt of her head, her expression unreadable, but her interest unmistakably piqued. Then there are the moments that almost slip by unnoticed, Bill's shoes scuffing the floor as he shifts position, his thumb tapping a counterpoint to the judge's gavel, a single silver hair brushing across his forehead when he leans forward. These small details accumulate like drops in a reservoir, building the pressure that will one day burst through. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth hums in the courtroom's fluorescent light. No one here has truly listened to Bill Carter, not his real story, not the one written in deeds rather than words. They've decided who he is before they ever bothered to ask. But silence, like a coiled spring, holds the power to surprise, to unbalance, to reveal what lies hidden beneath assumptions. The rising action here isn't in dramatic outbursts or impassioned speeches. It's in the hushed collective holding of breath, waiting for a truth no one has dared to speak aloud. As the afternoon light wanes and the hour grows late, the courtroom empties, leaving Bill Carter seated alone under the hum of those unforgiving lights. The worn benches, the peeling paint, the faint smell of coffee, all bear witness to a moment about to tip, a final pause, a heartbeat held, and the promise that silence, when properly understood, can be more than absence. It can be the calm before a revelation that no one saw coming. The courtroom air feels suddenly colder as District Attorney Michael Reynolds rises from his seat. He straightens his navy blue tie, smooths a crease in his charcoal suit, and turns toward the jury with a practiced flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he begins, voice clear and controlled. "We are here not simply to adjudicate a minor scuffle at a gas station, but to address a man who refuses to let go of a uniform he no longer wears." His eyes scan the panel, lingering on the schoolteacher who tapped her pen during Laura Jensen's defense, and the truck driver whose arms are crossed defensively. William Carter Reynolds continues is a man living in the shadow of his past, a past he wields like a weapon. Reynolds paces slowly before the jury box, every step measured. He stops by a small side table where photographs lie face down under a thin sheet of plastic. With one finger, he flips them over to reveal images of Carter in desert camouflage helmet perched at a jaunty angle, a younger Carter's eyes bright with purpose, rifle cradled in his arms. These photos, Reynolds says, are not relics of honor. They are trophies of a life he cannot leave behind. He taps one print gently. Do not mistake these medals for proof of heroism in today's world. Here in this courtroom, we judge present conduct, not battlefield valor from decades ago. His gaze flicks to Carter, who sits motionless at the defense table, arms folded across his chest. The faded flannel and scuffed boots might seem humble compared to the crisp uniforms in the pictures, but Reynolds makes sure the jury notices the contrast. "Look at him," he says softly, a man whose eyes still hold the desert sun's glare, yet he stands here unrepentant, refusing to take responsibility for threatening a civilian. The jury watches Carter's face, trying to read the calm tension etched into every line. Reynolds' voice takes on a sharper edge. He tells them about the gas station attendant who claimed Carter leaned across the pump with a voice cold as a gravestone, saying he could end me from 800 yards away. Reynolds doesn't need theatrics. His delivery is enough. He describes how the attendant's eyes widened in fear and how local gossip swirled into rumors of a sniper hiding in plain sight. "Is this the kind of man you want walking freely among your families?" Reynolds asks, arms wide, as if encompassing the entire courtroom. A man who weaponizes his silence turns every glance into a threat. He pauses, letting the question hang. The fluorescent lights hum above, and somewhere in the back a reporter adjusts her mic, eager to capture every stirring moment. Reynolds turns to the judge, offering a curt nod, before returning his attention to the jury. "This is not about dismissing a veteran service," he insists. "This is about recognizing danger when you see it." A decorated soldier who cannot shed his uniform, who misuses the weight of his past to intimidate the innocent. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not heroism. That is delusion. At the word delusion, Carter shifts slightly, sleeves rolling up to reveal a weathered forearm scarred faintly from old wounds. The scarring doesn't distract the jury as much as Reynolds hopes. Instead, some jurors glance back at the photos, whispering among themselves. Reynolds senses the shift and hones in. "Even those scars," he says, gesturing toward Carter's arms, "are marks of a man who can't reintegrate, who can't let the past remain buried. They're badges of brokenness, not badges of honor." He paces closer to Carter, voice lowering. "Mr. Carter, you thrived in the chaos of combat. You reveled in the power of a rifle at your shoulder. But this is a gas station. These are civilians. They pump fuel, collect coffee-load groceries. They don't sign up to be targets in your personal battlefield. Yet you stand here, weapon at the ready, in your mind's eye, ready to intimidate any who cross your path. Reynolds glances at Laura Jensen as though inviting her to challenge his narrative. But Laura sits still silent, saving her words for the closing. Reynolds' tone softens just enough to sound reasonable. "We owe our veterans our gratitude," he says, voice almost gentle. "We respect what they've done, but respect does not equate to impunity. A man who served does not gain the right to threaten others without consequence. No matter how many medals you hang on the wall, the law must treat you like any other citizen." He lifts his hand palm outward as if pressing an invisible barrier between Carter and the rest of society. "This isn't personal. It's about keeping our communities safe from those who cannot or will not leave their war behind." He steps back, folding his arms. The courtroom feels taut, as though bracing for a storm. Reynolds' closing is both precise and unsparing, a clinical portrait designed to eclipse any sympathy the jury might feel for an aging soldier. He returns the photos to the plastic covering and steps away, allowing a hush to settle. Even the hum of the lights seems to pause, hanging on the jury's next move. The judge nods, acknowledging Reynolds' argument, then turns to Laura Jensen for her rebuttal. Yet the impact of the prosecutor's portrait lingers. Carter's silence, once a sign of dignity and restraint, now threatens to be construed as guilt. The jury sits, pens poised, the weight of Reynolds' words heavy in their minds. As the case moves toward deliberation, the spectators file out in subdued clusters. Reporters consult their notebooks. The two deputies return to their post by the door, exchanges measured but watchful. Outside, the sky presses gray against the courthouse's red brick facade. The moment feels suspended between past and future, between a soldier's quiet strength and the prosecutor's insistence on threat. But within that silence, at the heart of the courtroom, William Carter remains unmoved. No flicker of anger crosses his features. He doesn't argue back, doesn't plead. He sits a living testament to battles fought and choices made, leaving the jury to decide whether his past defines him or whether their own assumptions will become the real verdict. And as the doors close on part 5 of this saga, you can't help but wonder, will justice honor a hero's silence, or will it mistake it for menace? The answer lies just beyond those heavy oak doors, waiting for the jury's final solitary verdict. The moment the jury filed out the courtroom seemed to exhale. The gavel had barely settled when chairs scraped softly against the floor. Whispers flickered, and spectators leaned forward expectantly, as though the verdict itself were a living thing waiting to emerge. In that brief lull, no one noticed the sleek obsidian black SUV that rolled silently up Main Street. Its engine whispered against the cracked pavement, pulling to a stop just beyond the courthouse's double doors, where the morning sunlight glinted off its polished surface. Inside, the bailiff unlocked the deliberation room and guided the jurors through the doorway, their footsteps echoing in the hushed chamber. Reporters rose camera lenses, pivoting toward the entrance, eager to capture exits that signaled resolution. The judge tapped her pen thoughtfully. The public defender gathered her notes, and the prosecutor straightened his jacket, already rehearsing what he would say once justice had its say. Yet none of them glanced toward the windows where the SUV sat waiting as if at attention. The courthouse's worn wooden floors carried a single deliberate footstep before anyone registered its owner. Outside the tinted glass, a door swung open with the soft click of heavy hinges. 4 silver stars caught the sun, a quiet flash that otherwise went unnoticed by the townspeople watching from across the street. The man who stepped out did so without urgency, his uniform immaculate, pressed to perfection, his posture as erect as the flagpole in front of the city hall. He paused at the curb, tilting his head toward the courthouse facade as though committing the memory of its peeling red bricks and faded plaque to mind. General Marcus Hayes inhaled deeply, the air carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle from a nearby planter. He placed a gloved hand at his side and surveyed the scene. The rusted mailboxes clustered by the dentist's office, the brass plaque on the library door, the distant chime of a church bell marking the hour. No sirens, no entourage, just him stepping into a story he had heard through hushed veteran channels weeks before. He didn't call out. He didn't flash credentials. He simply walked one careful stride after another toward the courthouse entrance. Inside, the public defender rose to fetch a glass of water, and a young reporter chatted about the likely verdict with a cameraman. The judge thumbed her glasses, marking her place in a legal pad. The entire scene felt suspended on the cusp of authority meeting resolution. And then those heavy double doors swung inward and the ripple began. General Hayes entered as the last juror disappeared behind the oak doors. For a fraction of a second, the courtroom held its breath. The deputies at the front row straightened. The receptionist at the back shot a questioning glance. Reporters lifted their lenses, whispering, "Is that who I think it is?" Yet no one spoke. The general, unannounced yet entirely at home, moved with the assurance of a man whose orders had once changed the course of battles. He paused just inside the door, letting his eyes travel the length of the bench. He noted the weary judge whose hair was flecked with gray, the prosecutor who still wore the confident crease in his brow, and the public defender whose shoulders sagged under the weight of lost opportunities. He acknowledged none of them. His gaze settled on the empty defense table where William Carter had sat for days silent as a stone carved by centuries of wind. No one knew why he'd come. A spectator, a press consultant, a concerned citizen. The anonymity of his arrival only deepened the intrigue. Some jurors craned their necks from the deliberation room, curious if the verdict meant they'd bring in more witnesses. Others whispered to one another, their sentences punctuated by furtive glances at the general's insignia. The courtroom's center of gravity had shifted around this unexpected presence. General Hayes began to walk each step deliberate and unhurried. His boots, more polished than Carter's own well-worn pair, tapped a steady rhythm across the hardwood. The overhead lights reflected off the stars on his collar, as if each one were pointing the way forward. He passed the reporter trying to raise a question, the deputy who cleared his throat. Even the bailiff who blinked at the courthouse schedule on his clipboard. No one blocked his path. No one asked for credentials. Respect, it seemed, had its own silent protocol. The air in the courtroom felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Conversations fell silent as Hayes approached the prosecution table. Michael Reynolds rose stiff as a statue and offered a half bow that the general neither acknowledged nor rejected. Across the aisle, Laura Jensen rose too, her expression a cross between relief and alarm. She recognized him immediately, not just because of the stars, but because of what they stood for: leadership, sacrifice, and a bond forged in the crucible of combat. Hayes stopped at the threshold of the jury box, turning his head to glance at the 12 faces before him. He unfurled a slight nod as though to say, "I know you." The jurors shifted in their seats, some stiffening, others leaning forward, the stern neutrality of their expressions giving way to subtle wonder. No one spoke until Hayes finally spoke, his voice low enough that only the front row caught its resonance. "I'm here for Mr. Carter." The simple statement rippled outward. The judge paused, pen hovering in midair, eyes locking on the general. Reynolds swallowed, his mouth working behind a forced calm. Murmurs skated across the gallery, questions dying before they fully formed. Hayes's gaze flicked to the defense table, now momentarily vacated. Permission to approach, he asked the court. Though his tone made it clear permission was a formality. Judge Ellis rose, her gavel resettling in its cradle. She inclined her head, and the brass railings seemed to part like the Red Sea. Hayes crossed the aisle each step, merging the unseen with the inevitable. Reporters shoved microphones forward, but the general raised a hand, quieting them as naturally as breathing. The room was his witness, but he would set the terms of his testimony. When he reached the empty chair where Carter had sat, he paused, fingertips grazing the worn wood. The grain felt familiar, like the stock of a rifle he once carried through foreign dust. With that solitary gesture, he claimed the space a place of judgment, about to become a place of reckoning. He then pivoted to face the jury, standing tall and still, as though the noise of the courthouse, the clack of typewriters, the hushed visitors had faded into the background. In that pregnant silence, you could almost hear the echoes of past campaigns, the crack of gunfire, the crackle of radios, the unspoken camaraderie of men huddled behind barricades. You could almost feel the weight of the uniform Hayes once wore, and the burdens he carried when he finally set it aside. He took a breath and began to speak not of law, but of loyalty, not of statutes, but of sacrifice. 31 years ago, he said, I was pinned down on a rooftop in Fallujah. My team scattered my men, wounded, the world swirling around me in noise and smoke. And then he showed up. He gestured toward the empty defense table as though Carter himself were standing there. Gunnery Sergeant William Carter didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot that saved my life and the lives of every man with me. He never sought recognition. He never boasted. His eyes scanned the jurors, seeking in them the spark he had once seen in his own troops' recognition of what truly matters. The courtroom leaned in. The prosecuting attorney pinched the bridge of his nose. The public defender closed and opened her mouth, gathering courage for her role. Cameras clicked, capturing the four-star general grounded in humility, using his rank not to demand attention, but to shine a light on a truth that had been buried beneath assumption. None of this would have happened if the SUV hadn't arrived. None of this would have unfolded if someone hadn't chosen to step forward unannounced, underestimated, and unseen until the moment it counted most. The arrival of that black vehicle and the man who emerged from it transformed a routine misdemeanor trial into something far greater, a reckoning with legacy, a challenge to prejudice, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful testimonies are delivered by those who choose to interrupt the narrative with the force of lived truth. As General Hayes's voice resonated through the hushed chamber, you realized that the unseen witness had become the center of the story, and that for William Carter and for every spectator in that room, the real deliberation was only just beginning. The courtroom door swung shut behind the last juror, and for a moment the hush felt oppressive. The gavel's echo had barely faded when speculation rippled through the assembled crowd. "They won't take long," someone whispered, and immediately everyone leaned forward, as if the walls themselves might spill the answer. Reporters shifted on their heels, cameras pivoting toward the heavy oak door that concealed the jury's deliberations, while deputies exchanged glances that carried equal parts impatience and unease. In the silence, the faint tap of a polished boot heel sounded from the back corridor. A handful of old Marines, Bill Carter's brothers-in-arms, had slipped into the hallway, faces lined with years of service and memories neither easily shared nor forgotten. They gathered beneath a faded "no loitering" sign, shoulders brushing as they spoke quietly. "He deserves more than they can give him in there," one murmured, voice low. Another cracked his knuckles, gaze fixed on the courtroom door. Their uniforms were long stowed away, replaced by civilian jackets and calloused hands that had known the weight of weapons. Yet these men stood ready to defend Carter once more this time, with nothing but their presence. Inside courtroom 3, the judge perched at her bench, fingers drumming a deliberate rhythm against the polished wood. Her eyes flicked to the silent defense table where Carter sat with his chain gone, but dignity intact, waiting as he always had. At the prosecutor's table, Michael Reynolds checked his watch, brow tightening beneath the glare of the fluorescent lights. 5 minutes, he muttered under his breath, as if that span of time could confirm everything he'd argued. Laura Jensen clenched the edge of her notebook, recalling Hayes's testimony, every precise detail of that 936-yard shot, every word that cut through the courtroom like a lifeline. Reporters jockeyed for position outside the closed door. A TV correspondent brushed a strand of hair behind her earphone, recording the hush, ready to capture the moment the jury emerged. "We've barely started," she sighed, as though disbelief alone could rewind the clock. A print journalist perched upon a folding chair, scribbling notes on a pad, glancing up only to notice the general's stars still etched in everyone's mind. The narrative had shifted so radically, what began as a simple misdemeanor had become a crucible for justice, legacy, and redemption. Outside, the old Marines watched the courthouse windows reflect an afternoon sky darkening with storm clouds. An unseen breeze rustled a stack of lost and found papers on a nearby windowsill. They shared nods but spoke little, each lost in thought. One fingered a dog tag that still hung from his chain, a silent prayer for the man whose story they knew better than anyone. They remembered Carter's silence on the battlefield, how it meant focus, how it meant survival. Now his silence in this room felt like a crucible of its own. Would the jury see the hero the general remembered, or judge the man the prosecutor painted? Back inside, the tension thickened. The judge glanced at her watch. 7 minutes now. She raised her gavel as if to call the bailiff forward, then thought better of it. Better to let the moment breathe. Reynolds exhaled slowly, folding his arms. "They're never this quick," he admitted to no one in particular, though he spoke loudly enough for several to hear. Jensen's lips pressed together. She dared not hope so soon. 5 minutes wasn't enough to wrestle with their own doubts. In the hallway, a sympathetic courthouse clerk poked her head out from the reception desk, clipboard in hand. She craned her neck to glimpse the deliberation room's frosted glass, where jurors only was etched in gold letters. She sighed and retreated, knowing better than to interrupt. A group of curious onlookers, two teenagers in school uniforms, a middle-aged couple clutching program pamphlets pressed closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull of collective anticipation. Inside the jury, foreperson rose and cleared his throat. "We have reached a verdict," he announced. And just like that, the air shifted. The judge nodded, her expression schooled into professional neutrality, though her eyes flickered with something softer. Relief, perhaps, or curiosity. The bailiff rapped the gavel twice and stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Reporters straightened cameras, lifted pens poised. The Marines pressed against the wall, straining to see through the crack in the doorway. Carter straightened too, shoulders squared, eyes flicking from the foreperson to the judge. The rays of the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating him in a glow that seemed almost intentional, as though the world finally paused to recognize his steadfast presence. The foreperson handed the verdict sheet through the rail, glancing briefly at the judge. Her gavel hovered mid-air, a silent command to prepare. The courtroom held its breath. Carter's face remained unreadable, mask-like, betraying no hope or fear. The judge cleared her throat and looked toward the gallery. "Will the defendants please rise?" Feet shuffled, chairs creaked, and the gallery rose as one. Lawyers stood, the general remained standing at the edge of the aisle, maintaining his quiet vigil. Then, in a voice that barely carried beyond the bench, the judge announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant." But that final word, the word that would shatter assumptions or cement them, hung suspended like a storm cloud at its darkest moment, ready to unleash its verdict on everyone in the room. In that pregnant pause, you felt the weight of every testimony, every glance, every unspoken doubt, and every silent prayer. And as the word finally fell, reshaping the narrative forever, you realized that in these swift deliberations, justice had become more than a decision. It had become a reckoning. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath the moment the jury foreperson announced, "We have reached a verdict." Chairs settled with a final sigh, pens clicked closed, and every spectator leaned forward, waiting for the gavel to fall. Yet before Judge Ellis could raise her hand, the double doors at the back swung wide, and in strode General Marcus Hayes. The motion felt rehearsed for cinema, a silent intrusion that shattered the building's stillness and pulled every eye toward its source. Hayes moved with a confidence that needed no announcement. From the first step, polished black boots tapped a steady rhythm on the scuffed wooden floor, each echo announcing, "I belong here." The receptionist at the front desk rose without a word, her fingers stilling on the computer keyboard. Bailiffs who had barely glanced up since opening statements snapped to attention and stepped aside, clearing his path with tacit deference. Even the public defenders and prosecutors, usually entrenched in their own worlds, shifted in their seats, the tension in the air suddenly centered on the man in uniform. He paused at the threshold as though savoring the tableau he'd stepped into. The gallery's rows of onlookers froze mid-breath. A reporter's finger hovered over a camera dial. The afternoon light slanted through high windows, casting long patterns across Hayes's shoulders, illuminating his crisp dress blues and the 4 silver stars that gleamed on his collar. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights and the distant murmur of Main Street outside. Time seemed to dilate around him as if the building itself recognized the gravity he carried. From his vantage point, Hayes surveyed every corner of Courtroom 3. His eyes swept the wooden pews where veterans whispered to one another, the cluster of reporters balancing cameras and notepads, the jurors seated like statues in their box, unreadable behind solemn faces. He noted the prosecutor's rigid posture, the public defender's taut shoulders, and Judge Ellis's slight frown, a curious mix of protocol and surprise. Yet he did not speak. The simple act of standing in that space in full uniform spoke volumes. Then, with a deliberate shift of weight, he stepped forward and pushed open the door to the gallery. The movement released a collective gasp. Eyes tracked his every footfall as he walked down the central aisle, each step measured, composed, unhurried. Cameras clicked, but no one dared ask a question. Hayes's presence absorbed the room's energy, redirecting it toward something larger than any misdemeanor case. William Bill Carter, seated at the defense table, glanced up, his own stillness breaking as he realized the visitor's identity. For days, Carter had maintained a stoic calm, never raising his voice, rarely shifting in his seat, but now his posture straightened. The silent acknowledgement passed between them, a general honoring the man who once saved his life. Carter's eyes glinted with a mixture of respect and caution. He did not move to greet Hayes, yet his gaze said more than words ever could. Hayes reached the front, pausing just beyond the prosecution table. He turned slightly, allowing every corner of the room to witness the unannounced arrival. Reporters raised their microphones, but Hayes held up a hand in unspoken request for quiet. The courtroom, conditioned to the clang of gavels and the murmur of objections, responded with an almost sacred hush. Even Judge Ellis sat back, pen suspended over legal pads, observing with a mixture of professional reserve and undeniable curiosity. In that charged silence, Hayes did not take the witness stand. He did not file any motions or demand the floor. He simply planted his feet and met the eyes of those who doubted, those who whispered about threats and intimidation. His uniform and the weight of his decorations spoke on his behalf. The air felt electric, the moment pregnant with possibilities. Slowly, Hayes turned his head toward the jury box. The jurors who had braced themselves for a routine verdict announcement studied him with rapt attention. They shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if to catch a whisper, others exchanging subtle glances. Their collective gaze held a question. Why was this four-star general here? What did he know that could alter their decision? Hayes's lips parted as though he might answer, but he remained silent. Instead, he offered a small nod, an acknowledgement that bridged the chasm between unspoken doubt and the testament he would soon deliver. No one in the room seemed capable of moving. The momentum of Hayes's entrance had stilled even the ebb and flow of courtroom life. Judge Ellis cleared her throat, drawing everyone's eyes back to the bench. "General Hayes," she said, voice measured, "you are recognized by this court." The title carried weight that reverberated across the room. The judge's gavel rested on its block, waiting. Hayes inclined his head in thanks, hands clasped behind his back, unwavering. He did not rush to the podium, but remained a poised sentinel in the center aisle. The energy in the gallery shifted once more. Where earlier there had been whispers about a veteran's supposed threats, now all that talk felt hollow. The focus had narrowed to one man whose mere presence challenged the narrative laid out by the prosecution. Reporters fanned out, capturing angles of Hayes's profile, the shimmer of stars on his collar, the silence that demanded to be heard. Carter watched with quiet intensity. No counselor at law could draft a more powerful statement of character than the general's unannounced appearance. It was a living rebuttal to every insinuation that Carter had become dangerous or delusional. Hayes's entrance told its own story, that Carter was a man of honor worth defending. Then in the hush that fell between a judge's recognition and the next syllable spoken, you could almost hear the collective intake of breath. The next words would mark the true turning point, the moment when cinematic intervention became an act of testimony. The audience leaned in hearts, pulsing with anticipation, as General Marcus Hayes prepared to speak, not as an observer, but as a witness to a hero's unspoken valor. The judge's pen hovered over her notes as General Marcus Hayes strode purposefully toward the defense table. For days the courtroom had hummed with anticipation, whispers of a verdict, murmurs of a veteran's supposed menace, the click of cameras lining the walls. Yet in that moment, everything else receded. Judge Marion Ellis looked up, her brow knitting in surprise. She had expected the jury's foreperson to return, not a four-star general interrupting the legal ritual. No one in the room piped an objection. No bailiff moved to stop him. Hayes's uniform spoke a language older than any courtroom etiquette authority, born of experience, trust, earned in the crucible of combat. William Bill Carter sat at the defense table, the empty chair beside him bearing the weight of dozens of hearings. His posture was still so still that a casual observer might think he was a statue carved from weathered oak. Yet his eyes followed every step Hayes took across the polished floor. In those eyes flickered gratitude, curiosity, and something deeper, recognition that the moment of his own reckoning had finally arrived. The gallery stilled as Hayes reached the table. Laura Jensen, the public defender, looked up from her notes, eyebrows raised. She had expected more testimony. Perhaps a surprise witness, but not this, a general whose very presence carried a story no legal brief could contain. Michael Reynolds, the prosecutor, straightened his practiced poise, wavering for an instant. He cleared his throat, ready to reassert control, but found himself silenced by the gentle weight of Hayes's gaze. General Hayes paused just behind the defense chair, his back straight, the silver stars on his collar glinting like beacons. He seemed to absorb the room's tension with a calm that belied the urgency of his purpose. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes sweeping from the jury to Judge Ellis, from the prosecutor's bench to the silent rows of onlookers. It was as if he were taking stock of the place where justice and memory would soon collide. Then, with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than waiting for permission, Hayes spoke. His voice was low but carried effortlessly across the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, and at the sound of his words the gallery leaned forward. Even the light fixtures seemed to pulse in sympathy with the gravity of his tone. "I ask permission to address the court." Judge Ellis blinked, then inclined her head. "Proceed, General." She said, her voice respectful but curious about the contents of the revelation she sensed was coming. Reynolds shifted in his seat, subtly adjusting his tie as if girding himself against the unknown. Jensen offered the general a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that she too awaited the turn in the story that only he could deliver. Hayes turned toward the jury box, legs planted firmly. The jurors sat in stunned silence. Their collective expressions flickered between skepticism and intrigue. None had expected their deliberation to be interrupted by a man of such stature, nor to find themselves at the center of a narrative larger than any legal argument. Their pens rested on notepads, but the words they might have written lay forgotten now. "I apologize for the intrusion," Hayes began, "but I could not stand by and remained silent." He paused, letting the weight of his confession hang in the air. Carter's gaze met Hayes's, and for a fleeting moment all the years between Fallujah and this courtroom seemed to collapse into a single defining instant. The onlookers leaned in, anticipating the twist that would reshape their understanding of the man in the defendant's chair. 31 years ago, Hayes continued, "I was a young lieutenant leading a small element in the siege of Fallujah. The night was black as pitch, and the air smelled of danger and dust. Our comms had been cut, our extraction point compromised. 2 of my men lay wounded, and I was pinned down behind a crumbling wall, the enemy closing in on every side. It was a moment when most would have prayed for a miracle." His gaze flicked to Carter, and the general's voice softened. But then Gunnery Sergeant William Carter appeared. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly hushed by the judge's raised hand. Carter's lips parted slightly as he listened to the story he had buried in the back of his mind, perhaps hoping no one would ever bring it up again. Hayes's words painted the scene with vivid clarity, the howl of distant mortar, the quick click of rifle bolts, the glint of muzzle flashes beyond the rubble. Carter's figure had been a silhouette against the inferno, steady and unwavering. "Sergeant Carter took up a sniper rifle," Hayes said, and without a single word he fired 12 confirmed rounds in under 5 minutes. Each shot found its mark, cutting through the chaos to carve a path that led my men and me to safety. One shot through a rooftop hatch at 936 yards, a moving target, a crosswind. He did not hesitate. He did not pause to look back. He simply did what had to be done. Hayes watched the jury react. Some eyes widened. Others darted to the photographs displayed earlier by the prosecutor, images of a younger Carter in desert patina rifle resting on his steady shoulders. But now those pictures resonated with a different truth. Not the face of a reckless old soldier, but the likeness of a silent protector whose missions had shaped the destinies of lives. When Hayes paused, the courtroom seemed suspended between heartbeats. Even the fluorescent lights above hummed with anticipation. Carter remained seated, his jaw clenched, the usual calm in his eyes, tempered by the memory of that long-ago mission. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply listened, as though the story were as much a revelation to him as to everyone else. Hayes resumed, his tone laced with both gratitude and apology. "I never learned his name until years later. He didn't tell me. He didn't seek praise, promotions, medals. He disappeared back into the dust, returning to missions I had never named. But because of his actions that night, I lived. And because I lived, I owe him more than words can convey. So when I heard of his trial here for a misdemeanor, when I heard whispers that he was dangerous, delusional, unfit for civilian life, I knew I had to come." A hush followed Hayes's confession, as though the courtroom itself absorbed the truth. Laura Jensen's shoulders slumped, relief and vindication flooding her posture. Reynolds' face paled, his earlier confidence eroded by the weight of the general's testimony. Jurors exchanged glances, pens falling from their fingertips. Even Judge Ellis closed her notebook, her expression moving beyond surprise to something softer. Respect, perhaps, or regret that such a man had been reduced to uncertainty. Hayes spoke a final time, his voice like steel and silk interwoven. This is not a plea for special treatment. This is a call for justice, informed by truth. William Carter's silence is not a threat. It is the quiet of a man who has seen too much to speak lightly. His refusal to explain himself is not stubbornness, but restraint. And if any of you still doubt, I urge you to consider the alternative to convict a hero who saved lives because you never saw the war. He fought the bullets he chose not to fire, the sacrifices he carried in silence. He stepped back, allowing the courtroom to reclaim its breath. The gallery exhaled collectively, the tension that had gripped every heart now loosening in the wake of the general's revelation. Carter rose, then moving to stand beside Hayes with a grace that belied his weathered years. Their silent unity spoke volumes, two soldiers bound by a single act of courage, now reunited in the civility of a Southern courthouse. Judge Ellis cleared her throat, her gavel poised. In light of this extraordinary testimony, she began, voice steady. This court finds that the charges against Mr. Shamawursti Carter are hereby dismissed. The gavel fell with a decisive finality, not as a blow, but as a seal on a truth long overdue. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps as veterans who had gathered in quiet solidarity at the edges of the building stood and saluted. Reporters jostled for interviews, but Carter and Hayes walked down the aisle side by side, unhurried, their footsteps echoing with the rhythm of a story reclaimed. Carter's jeans brushed against Hayes's polished boots, a silent testament to a bond that transcended rank, trial, and rumor. And so the plot twist, delivered not by a sudden turn of events, but by the weight of lived truth, reshaped every assumption the courtroom had held. A four-star general's revelation became the lens through which the world would now see William Carter, not as a relic of war, but as a quiet sentinel whose silence had always spoken louder than any charge could. 30 years ago, General Marcus Hayes began, his voice low yet unwavering. I was pinned down in Fallujah. My team was scattered. We had wounded. No extraction. The courtroom seemed to lean in as though drawn by an invisible thread. The jurors shifted in their seats, pens momentarily still in their hands, while reporters raised their cameras to capture every nuance of the general's expression. Across the aisle, Laura Jensen's hand tightened around her notes, and Michael Reynolds swallowed hard, his confident posture faltering for the first time. Hayes paused, letting the gravity of those words settle. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed as if in sympathy, and the polished wood of the defense table gleamed under the weight of expectation. Outside, a breeze stirred leaves against the courthouse windows, a soft reminder that life moved on even as history unfolded inside these walls. When the mortar rounds stopped echoing, he continued, and the dust cleared just enough for me to see I realized I was alone. My radios were dead, my men were exposed, and the only route out was through a stretch of open ground under enemy fire. He took a breath, scanning the faces before him, not just the jurors, but the judge, the lawyers, even the spectators squeezed into the back rows. Then Gunnery Sergeant William Carter appeared. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by Judge Ellis's raised eyebrow. Carter himself remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened on the table edge. He had never spoken of that night. The details lived inside him like scars, but he had never offered them in testimony. Now, with Hayes bearing witness, his own silence took on a new resonance. He knelt in the rubble. Hayes said, voice firm, calibrating his shot, by feel, by instinct, by years of training and sacrifice. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He simply fired. The general's gaze held steady, as if he could see the trajectory of every bullet launched that night. 12 confirmed hits in under 5 minutes. He cut a path for us through a rain of bullets and broken glass. One shot 936 yards through a rooftop hatch on a moving target in a crosswind most snipers would have considered impossible. Reynolds shifted in his seat, his cheeks flushing. He had tried to reduce Carter to a temperamental old vet clinging to glory days, but here was proof that those days had saved lives, not only the lives of soldiers in a distant desert, but his own life, the life of every man who had drawn breath beside him. The jurors exchanged glances. A truck driver scratched his cheek thoughtfully. A schoolteacher in the front row rubbed her fingers over the edge of her program as if feeling the texture of the words. Laura Jensen rose slightly in her seat, drawing in a breath of vindication. She had known Carter's record had seen the dusty commendation folder in the clerk's office, had tried to introduce it during opening statements, only to be rebuffed. Now, with Hayes recounting events in vivid detail, the courtroom's understanding of Carter shifted from rumor and assumption to something far more tangible to a man who had looked down the sights of a rifle and chosen life. Hayes let the story breathe for a moment, eyes dropping to the polished floor. He spoke again, softer this time. I watched his muzzle flash, heard the echo of each shot against those crumbling walls, and I knew then that my life did not end that day. His voice quavered ever so slightly, betraying gratitude older than the courtroom itself. I owe him more than words can express. A single bead of moisture glinted at the corner of a juror's eye. The veteran brothers who had gathered in the hallway broke their quiet vigil, leaning closer to hear their shared past, giving weight to every syllable. From the cramped press table, a reporter blinked back surprise, realizing that this story was no longer about a misdemeanor. It was a testimony of sacrifice, heroism, and profound humility. Hayes straightened and allowed the silence to stretch. Then, almost conversationally, he added, "When I saw Mr. Carter here in this very courtroom facing a charge of intimidation for words he may or may not have spoken, I knew I had to speak." His gaze traveled from Carter to the jury and back. "Not to erase his guilt or innocence in your eyes, that is your duty, but to remind you that some silences carry more weight than any threat ever could." The jurors scribbled furiously now, their impartial facade giving way to human empathy. The judge lowered her gavel, forgetting its purpose for the span of a heartbeat. Reynolds sank into his chair, the earlier certainty drained from his posture. Laura Jensen allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Hayes continued, voice steady. "Bill Carter never bragged about that night. He never claimed medals or parades. He returned home quietly, haunted by memories he refused to share. And because of those memories, because of his restraint, his precision, his selflessness, he saved lives that day, including mine." A hush fell so complete that the hum of the air conditioning became audible. The clerks behind the desk paused in their tasks. A janitor about to sweep the hall leaned against a wall to catch the end of the testimony. In that unhurried cadence, the distance between Fallujah and Main Street seemed to vanish. The same scars that marred the desert sands now etched themselves on the hearts of those inside the courthouse. Hayes glanced at Carter, and for the first time the man at the defense table nodded. It was a subtle motion, no grand flourish, but it spoke volumes, a mutual recognition of a bond that needed no audience. The general turned back to the jury. "I ask you to consider not just the words Mr. Carter may have spoken at a gas station, but the words he never uttered on a battlefield where silence meant survival." He stepped away slowly, returning to the center aisle, his boots echoing against the hardwood floor. Reporters leaned forward, capturing every angle for the evening news. The judge cleared her throat and looked to Reynolds. The prosecutor's gaze fell, unable to meet her eyes. A moment later, the general turned his attention entirely to the bench. "Your Honor, thank you for allowing me this time." He inclined his head respectfully. Judge Ellis recovered her composure and pounded her gavel, once a soft but resonant confirmation that this chapter of testimony had closed. "Thank you, General Hayes. The court appreciates your service and your words." Her voice carried a warmth that replaced the earlier formality. As Hayes nodded and stepped down, Carter rose to his feet. The courtroom held its breath once more. Carter took a few measured steps and stood beside the general. No handshake, no arm around a shoulder. Just two soldiers side by side, bound by an unspoken history. The contrast was striking: Carter in worn denim boots, scuffed from years of wear, and Hayes in full dress uniform, medals gleaming. Laura Jensen rose, gathering her papers. "Your Honor," she began, voice rich with the conviction that Carter's silence now spoke for itself in light of this testimony. "I move for dismissal." Reynolds did not rise to oppose. His earlier arguments seemed hollow against the weight of living testament. Judge Ellis paused, then nodded. "Motion granted. Charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed." The gavel fell, its sound gentle, yet irrevocable. The jury stood their verdict rendered unnecessary by a higher truth. Reporters erupted into soft applause. The veterans gathered in the hallway, their salutes echoing in the corridor. Outside Main Street hummed with its usual rhythm, cars, passing shoppers browsing the distant call of a church bell. But inside Courthouse 3 had shifted. A hero's testimony had traveled from a war-torn rooftop in Fallujah to a modest courtroom in a sleepy town, transforming suspicion into respect, rumor into revelation, and the promise of justice into reality. And as William Carter and General Marcus Hayes walked out into the sunlight, their boots tapping in quiet unison, the world beyond those doors carried with it a lesson far greater than any verdict that true valor often speaks in the hush before the shot, and that sometimes the loudest triumphs are delivered in silence. General Hayes shifted his weight on the witness stand and let his gaze travel slowly around the courtroom. The faces that had once eyed William Carter with suspicion now hung on his every word, their expressions softening, fracturing open under the weight of truth. This man never asked for medals. Hayes said, voice calm yet resonant. He never sought praise. He paused, and in that pregnant silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade away. The only sound was the collective heartbeat of a room realizing it had judged too quickly. Hayes's eyes locked onto Carter's for an instant, a look that spoke of shared battles and unspoken debts. Then he turned to face the jury, the judge, the crowded gallery of reporters and townsfolk. But if you think his silence today is a threat, you're wrong. With that, he bent at the knee, lowering himself to the polished wood floor. The gesture felt monumental, impossible, even given the crisp authority of his uniform adorned with 4 silver stars. Yet there he knelt, head bowed in a gesture older than any gavel's strike, a public apology for a system that had forgotten its own. The courtroom held its breath. Deputies froze mid-stance, a bailiff's hand hovered over his holster, and reporters stopped clicking their pens. Judge Ellis sat rigid behind her bench, her mouth slightly ajar, eyes wide. You could almost hear the echo of the universe pausing, as though even time itself had recognized the weight of what was unfolding. Bill Carter sat motionless at the defense table. For days he had been the picture of understatement, his presence more spoke than shout. He had accepted his fate in silence, neither begging nor boasting. But now seeing a 4-star general, a man of equal rank though higher in stars, kneel before him, Carter's usual calm cracked. His throat worked for a moment as he fought back the raw tide of emotion that surged behind his steady gaze. Carter's hands tightened around the edge of the table knuckles, paling, but he did not rise or move to help Hayes. He simply watched, allowing the moment to land fully on every soul in the room. Across the aisle, Laura Jensen's fingers trembled over her notes. She had never seen her stoic client moved by words, much less by public gestures of contrition. She caught Judge Ellis's eye, and the judge's own expression betrayed a flicker of tears glinting at the corners. Michael Reynolds. The prosecutor slumped forward, his earlier bravado evaporated, replaced by a rare vulnerability. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple as he realized that the narrative he had meticulously constructed lay in ruins at Hayes's feet, literally. In the gallery, veterans who had gathered in quiet solidarity rose slightly in their seats, as though to salute but unsure how to do so when ceremony itself had transformed. An elderly woman clutching a folded flag let out a soft sob. A young reporter camera forgotten at her side wiped an eye with the sleeve of her blazer. The air tasted of awe and something deeper regret for the moments wasted on assumptions and fear. Hayes remained kneeling, unhurried, unwavering. His head stayed bowed, shoulders squared, even as he lowered his body. The uniform he wore, pristine, unblemished, seemed almost too bright in contrast to the worn denim and scuffed boots of the man he honored. And yet that contrast spoke to the heart of the story. Heroism that never asked for spotlight, valor that went unrecognized until now. After what felt like an eternity, Hayes rose slowly, his boot heels clicking softly against the hardwood. He turned and looked directly at Carter, who now stood as if compelled by an invisible force. Their eyes met, and in that moment no words were necessary. The general extended a hand, a gesture of equality and solidarity rather than superiority. Carter accepted it. Their grips firm, the two men clasped in the kind of handshake that sealed more than a trial's end. It sealed a friendship forged in combat and cemented in compassion. Judge Ellis cleared her throat. Her voice choked with emotion as she struggled to reclaim the formality of her role. The gavel felt heavy in her hand, but when she let it fall, the sound was softer than usual, less an instrument of judgment and more a benediction. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, she began, "I hereby dismiss all charges against Mr. Carter effective immediately." The gavel rose and fell again this time as a punctuation that rang with finality and relief. The courtroom erupted into subdued applause echoing like distant thunder. Veterans in the gallery stood and saluted. Reporters rose, some to record final statements, others simply to witness this rare convergence of military honor and civilian justice. Laura Jensen wept silently, tears tracking down her cheeks as she gathered her papers. Reynolds remained seated for a long moment, his face a mask of humility and unspoken apology before he too rose and collected his briefcase. Outside sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, illuminating the center aisle in a golden glow. Carter and Hayes walked down that aisle side by side, no longer defendant and witness, no longer general and gunnery sergeant, but simply two men bound by shared sacrifice and renewed dignity. Carter's boots tapped quietly against the wood. Hayes's polished shoes kept pace, each step echoing the unfolding of a story that had begun with suspicion and ended in reverent recognition. On the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. Veterans who had watched from the periphery now stepped forward, offering handshakes, salutes, and tears. Neighbors who had once whispered rumors now offered apologies, shaking Carter's hand with genuine respect. Reporters jostled for final quotes, but even the microphone felt inadequate to capture the gravity of what had transpired. As the pair descended the stone steps, a soft breeze stirred the American flag overhead, as though saluting in solidarity. A local pastor, having slipped out of service early to catch this moment, lifted his Bible and offered a benediction for the two men before them. Carter and Hayes paused, heads bowed in mutual respect before walking off into the sunlight together, a pair of comrades on a new mission to ensure that heroism, even when silent, never goes unnoticed again. And in that moment, every person present understood that true valor is not measured by medals nor by declarations, but by the quiet strength of one who does what must be done without fanfare, and by the humility of another who kneels to make sure the world remembers. The gavel's strike sounded almost gentle, a soft thud, that nevertheless carried finality through the hushed courtroom. Judge Marion Ellis sat back. Gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, jurors still perched in their seats. Reporters frozen, in mid-scribble deputies leaning forward as though hoping to catch an echo of the moment. In light of this testimony, she intoned, voice steady but filled with gravity. All charges are dismissed, effective immediately. At her words, the metal cuffs binding William Bill Carter's wrists clattered against his belt, then tumbled to the floor. The sound, harsh metallic, seemed incongruous in the quiet space, yet it resonated like a release from something far heavier than steel. For days, those chains had symbolized suspicion, prejudice, the weight of unasked questions. Now they lay forgotten at his feet, relics of a story rewritten by truth. Carter sat motionless as the bailiff knelt to unclasp the cuffs. His hands rose slowly, as though rediscovering limbs that had become unfamiliar through constraint. He flexed his fingers once, then twice, eyes fixed on the judge. No triumph flickered in his gaze, only the serene acceptance of a man who has long known his worth, regardless of verdict. The courtroom collectively inhaled as if startled by the sudden absence of tension, then exhaled in a single unison sigh. Laura Jensen, the public defender whose faith in Carter had never wavered, rose from her seat. She moved to his side, gathering her papers as she walked. For a moment she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, an unspoken acknowledgement of battles fought both inside and outside those walls. Carter offered her a modest nod. No words, just a shared look that spoke volumes about the journey they had traversed together. At the prosecution table, Michael Reynolds gathered his briefcase in slow compliance with procedure. His earlier confidence had drained away like ink in water. He exchanged a brief glance with Judge Ellis, an unspoken apology perhaps for having overlooked the very human story at the heart of his legal arguments. He rose and inclined his head to Carter, a gesture of respect softening the edge of defeat. In that gesture lay recognition that justice demands more than evidence, it demands understanding. In the gallery, the veterans who had watched from the margins stood as one. Some reached for their caps hats raised to their chests in salute. Others simply lifted their heads high, eyes misting as they paid tribute to the man who had once saved their lives and to the system that had nearly forgotten him. Reporters filed out into the hallway. Voices hushed as they updated live feeds, charges dismissed. Veteran vindicated. But even their words seemed inadequate, unable to capture the depth of what had unfurled in that courtroom. Carter rose to his full height, lean and unadorned in his faded flannel and scuffed boots. He paused at the defense table, taking in the setting that had become both crucible and confession chamber. His boots pressed firmly into the polished wood, the echoes of every step resonating like the closing lines of a storied career. He turned his head to the jury box, eyes meeting each juror in turn, not with accusation, but with quiet gratitude. A faint nod to the front row schoolteacher, a subtle lift of the chin to the truck driver who had sat in stoic judgment, a lingering glance at the foreperson who had delivered the foregone conclusion. The judge watched him with a softening expression, her gavel lying inert on its block, as though unwilling to reclaim its power. Carter allowed these moments to stretch, neither rushing to leave nor drawing undue attention. He was home now, free of both chains and misunderstanding, yet still bound by the same humility that had defined his life. General Marcus Hayes rose as Carter prepared to move. He approached with steady steps, eyes alight with pride. Carter looked over his shoulder and their gazes locked. No words passed between them, none were needed. Hayes extended his hand once more, and Carter accepted their grip firm. For a moment, they stood together at the heart of the courtroom, officer and sniper witness, and witnessee linked by an unspoken covenant of honor. Outside the courthouse steps buzzed with activity. Veterans flanked the entryway, some offering silent salutes as Carter and Hayes emerged. Media crews jockeyed for position, reporters thrusting microphones forward. But veterans parted for them, creating a pathway marked by respect rather than spectacle. Carter's footsteps echoed on the stone, Hayes' footsteps beside him, purposeful and unhurried. The sun, now dipping toward late afternoon, cast long shadows that stretched behind them as though the past reached out to follow. Neighbors who had once whispered idle rumors now approached with outstretched hands, voices hushed. "I'm sorry," one woman murmured, pressing her palm to his forearm. A young man offered a firm handshake. Carter met each with the same composed grace he had shown all along, his eyes conveying that acknowledgement mattered more than words of regret. At the bottom of the steps, the veterans formed a guard of honor. Caps in hands, they lined the sidewalk in solidarity. As Carter and Hayes walked through, each veteran offered a crisp salute. The echo of metal against fabric was a drumbeat of collective memory, a tribute to sacrifices made and recognized at last. When Hayes extended his hand once more, Carter clasped it, the two walking forward together into a night newly illuminated by understanding. In the wake of dismissal, the town breathed anew. Main Street's chatter resumed, but filtered now through fresh perspectives. The barbershop door swung open for Carter's return, and the librarian peered from the library window with a nod of welcome. Even the courthouse, that modest brick structure, seemed to stand taller, as if it had reclaimed its purpose by remembering the hero within its walls. Behind them, Judge Ellis offered one last nod to the departing pair before turning to her clerk. The gavel lay silent, its purpose fulfilled. Laura Jensen stepped outside moments later, her face alight with the quiet joy of a defender whose client had finally stood unburdened. For Carter, the long road from Fallujah to Main Street had reached its rightful end, not with a parade, but with a simple, dignified exoneration that spoke more eloquently than any medal ever could. And as the sun finally dipped below the rooftops, ordinary townspeople paused in doorways and on sidewalks, sharing glances that said, "Did you see that proof that sometimes the most profound justice arrives, not with ceremony, but with the soft fall of a gavel and the release of forgotten chains?" The courtyard beyond the courthouse steps had never felt more alive. A line of veterans, caps in hands and salutes held steady, formed an honor guard that stretched across the sun-washed pavement. Each man and woman stood at attention, their silhouettes etched against the golden light of late afternoon, creating a corridor of respect through which William Bill Carter passed. His boots clicked against the flagstone in a steady cadence, Each step a silent beat that seemed to echo the gratitude in every heart watching him walk free. Carter's gaze remained forward, yet his shoulders carried a lightness that had been absent for too many days. The denim jacket he wore, its sleeves slightly frayed, caught the sun in highlights that danced across the worn fabric. Behind him, General Marcus Hayes fell into step, not as escort, but as companion. Two soldiers who had shared a singular night of chaos and courage, now walking side by side into a calmer world that still needed reminders of what true bravery looks like. As they reached the edge of the Guard of Honor, Carter paused. The veterans raised their caps in unison, a gesture so precise it might have been choreographed, yet born entirely of genuine admiration. Carter's eyes flicked to the older Marine who had once fought beside him on distant sands, and that man's stiff salute loosened into a nod of affirmation. In that nod was the unspoken acknowledgement that heroism does not demand applause, that the quietest acts often carry the greatest weight. The crowd beyond the veterans' neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers had formed a loose semicircle. Cameras clicked and tripods wobbled as journalists captured the moment. But their recorded frames could not contain the full measure of relief and respect that filled the air. A local teacher wiped her eyes. A shopkeeper crossed himself. A teenage boy whispered, "That's what real heroes look like," as though discovering for the first time that heroes walk among us every day. At the center of it all, Carter and Hayes stopped. No words were spoken at first. The silence held a power that made speech unnecessary. Then slowly, Hayes placed a hand on Carter's shoulder, his 4 silver stars glinting in the sunlight. Carter looked over his shoulder, and their eyes met eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that now saw a world capable of understanding at least this much, that gratitude can take many forms, from a soldier's salute to a judge's ruling, from a general's testimony to a neighbor's handshake. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of magnolia from a tree planted years ago by a woman long retired. The petals fluttered, drifting through the sunbeams like white confetti, marking a triumph quiet without fanfare, but deeply felt. Carter's lips curved into a subtle smile, the first in days, and he raised his hand in a slight wave to the gathered crowd. The gesture rippled through them. Some waved back, others simply murmured, "Thank you," as though the words themselves unlocked decades of unspoken reverence. Then, as if cued by memory, the narrator's voice entered the moment, not as an intrusion, but as an embrace of shared reflection. True strength often wears no uniform. The voice began warm and resonant, carrying over the stillness left by Carter's footsteps. It walks among us in worn boots and faded jackets, in quiet nods and steadfast resolve. It protects without seeking praise, and sacrifices without demand for recognition. The words settled over the scene like a gentle benediction. The camera pulled back, capturing the full arc of Carter's journey, from the handcuffs that once bit into his wrists to the open sky he now walked beneath. The veterans lowered their caps, allowing the sun to kiss their weathered faces, and even the courthouse's red brick facade seemed to stand taller, as if basking in the acknowledgement that justice once delayed had finally been served. Now the narrator continued, "We invite you to become part of this story. Share below the name of someone you know, a family member, a friend, a neighbor who has never asked for medals or a spotlight, but has changed your life in some way. Tell us what their courage looked like when no one was watching." The call to action felt like passing a torch, a way to ensure that the quiet heroes among us received their moment in the light, however brief. As the narrator spoke, the scene shifted to snapshots of faces in the crowd. Eyes glistening, lips moving in silent agreement, thumbs poised over smartphones ready to type. The sense of community was palpable here, was a moment inviting everyone, however far removed from Carter's story, to connect with their own experiences of valor and humility. The narrator's final words drifted across the tableau. If you believe tales like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe. Join us in lifting up the stories that remind us what it means to serve, to protect, and to sacrifice without applause. Because heroes walk among us every day, and sometimes all it takes is a single voice to break the silence. In response, hands reached for phones, thumbs tapped keys, and the comments section below the video began to fill with stories of grandparents who waited years for recognition, of teachers who offered hope without reward, of neighbors who stepped in when tragedy struck. Each story a testament to quiet courage, each name a salute to unsung valor. as the light continued to fade into the warm hues of early evening. Carter and Hayes turned and walked down Main Street, their silhouettes long and unhurried. Behind them, the veterans saluted one final time, before dispersing, some to families waiting on porches, others back to lives that in their simplicity held the same depth of character that had defined Carter's journey. And so the chapter closed not with fireworks or fanfare, but with the promise of countless stories still waiting to be told. In that promise lay the truest victory, the understanding that every person carries within them the capacity for heroism, and that by shining a light on one story, we illuminate the countless others flickering quietly in the wings, ready to step forward when given the chance to be seen.